I Think of Thee is a poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, written for her husband-to-be, Robert Browning, whose name will probably be familiar to you because he wrote the poem Porphyria's Lover, which also appears on the Love and Relationships cluster. It's a fairly confusing poem. The meaning at times is a little bit ambiguous, but essentially it's about her feelings for her fiance, and the ways in which when he's not there and she begins to think about him, it sort of, the thoughts begin to almost take over her mind to a point where she's so overwhelmed with emotion and feeling that she can't even focus and she can't even think straight. It's really a poem about what it is to be really deeply, madly in love with somebody, almost to the point where you kind of put them on a pedestal, almost in a religious sense. The poem is a sonnet, which means it's a 14-line love poem, and let's take a close look at it. I'm going to walk you through it line by line, talk about the meanings, pull out the language features, etc, etc. The first thing to notice is that the title and the opening line directly address Robert Browning, or the object of the speaker's affections personally. I think of thee. Thee means you. So we've got this direct address, which makes the poem very, very intimate and personal straight away. This is a poem, as I already said, that was written for Elizabeth Barrett Browning's fiance before she married him. So before she became Elizabeth Barrett Browning, she wrote this poem about him and for him. And as such, it was a poem that was never ever intended to be published. When Robert Browning saw these poems later on, he thought they were so good that he suggested to her and eventually convinced her to publish them. So that's the first thing to be aware of, just that "the" in the title, the term "the," and the way in which it's used to make the poem personal. So, starting the poem, looking at the opening line, I think of thee, my thoughts do twine and bud. You'll notice immediately that the opening line echoes the title, I think of thee, but what's different here is that we've got this exclamation mark. Exclamation marks, as we know, tend to connotate passion, excitement, and that exclamation mark to me suggests that she's very, very passionate and very, very excited about her husband to be. We've also got the dashes, and when we combine those with the exclamation mark, we've got something called a caesura. The effect of the caesura here is that it makes us pause. I think of thee, and then there's that pause. And to me, the way that I read this personally is almost that when she says it, I think of thee, she's almost so overwhelmed with passion the moment she starts thinking about him that she actually has to take a breath. So I think of thee. You know, it's that excitement. There's that dramatic pause as she almost, every time she thinks about him, she almost misses a breath. Or to put it into a kind of modern vernacular that you might find in perhaps pop music, in the context of pop music, her heart skips a beat. You know, it's that sort of thing. So straight away, it's a very, very intense poem. So she says, I think of thee, my thoughts do twine and bud about thee as wild vines about the tree. And straight away we get a simile, and she compares her thoughts as almost like wild vines that kind of wrap themselves around a tree and climb around a tree. The word wild here to me suggests that her thoughts are out of control. That adjective to me suggests that she feels that her thoughts are out of control. But also the word bud kind of suggests fertility. It suggests freshness, newness. So there's a kind of positive connotation to this love. It's fresh, it's new, it's fertile. And she gives us this image of the vines kind of wrapping themselves about a tree. And if you think about what happens when vines wrap around a tree, when you get a tree and it becomes covered in, say, creeping ivy or some sort of a vine, eventually what it starts to do is actually cover the tree completely and obscure the tree. So what she's kind of saying here, as I'm reading it, is that when she begins to think about him, her thoughts are like these vines crawling over a tree, and the tree is almost the image of him. But her thoughts quickly become so overwhelming and so out of control and so wild, to use that adjective, that she actually can't concentrate, she can't focus on him. Her head just starts swimming with emotion, and before long she can't even see the image of him anymore. She can't even see the tree. She's just overwhelmed with these feelings. So it's quite an abstract poem straight away. My thoughts do twine and bud about thee as wild vines about a tree put out broad leaves. We've got some enjambment there. Wild vines about the tree putting out broad leaves. And soon there's naught to see except the straggling green which hides the wood. It's worth, I think, thinking about this idea of the straggling green. Straggling green is not so positive. To me, the idea of straggling green refers perhaps to the idea that she can't keep her thoughts in check. It's also slightly less romantic than twine vines. Perhaps we feel that she considers her emotions to almost be out of control. The fact that they hide the wood suggests that she's overwhelmed and all consumed by her thoughts. It's also worth, I think, thinking about the image of him as a tree. A tree is something that's strong, lots of positive connotations, strong, wise, and almost we have him here almost propping her up. You know, he's somebody that's strong, he's somebody that doesn't move, and he's very solid, and perhaps she feels that he's very solid in her life. So that imagery and that idea of him being a tree and the symbolism of a tree, I think, are also quite important. You know, a tree has good, strong, solid roots, and perhaps she feels that he's somebody that's very solid, dependable, reliable in her life, you know, perhaps wise as well. In the fifth line, she refers to him directly again. But here she refers to him as a palm tree. Yet, O my palm tree, be it understood, I will not have my thoughts instead of thee, who art dearer, better. And this, to me, really begins to bring us to the crux of the poem. The thoughts of him are not good enough. They're not enough for her. She's missing him, and the thoughts of him that she's having are not really giving her what she wants. What she wants is him in the flesh. But what's interesting here is the way that she refers to him as a palm tree. Not just a palm tree, but my palm tree. A palm tree has very exotic connotations, which perhaps refer to the newness and the mystery of their love. If you think about a palm tree, it's something that we don't get in drizzly rural England. It's something very exotic, something very tropical, and that perhaps is just a reference to the excitement, the mystery. It's something from mysterious lands. So that's one way of looking at the palm tree. And if we are to think about it like that, we can think about where do we get palm trees? We often get them in deserts, and a palm tree is almost like an oasis in a desert. You know, it's somewhere where you've got this barren landscape of nothing but sand and heat and sky, and then all of a sudden you've got somewhere where there's a bit of water and there's freshness and there's newness and there's growth. Barrett Browning was in her late 30s when she wrote this, so perhaps she felt that her life until now was a bit barren, a bit like a desert, and perhaps the palm tree represents the growth and the newness in a life that was formerly kind of barren and devoid of love, and that growth and that newness that he brings to her life. So perhaps in that sense the palm tree could symbolise that as well. It also keys in with the idea in the first stanza of the bud, the idea of freshness, newness. However, there's also a reading of this which is perhaps a bit more religious. Palms have a lot of religious symbolism. If we think about Palm Sunday, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem, his followers scattered palm trees in front of him. So if we're to take it with a religious connotation, and she was a very religious person, perhaps she could also be saying that her love almost has a religious aspect to it. Perhaps she's almost devoted to him. So there's two ways of reading that. We can read it as a palm tree that represents kind of newness, mystery, the exotic, the growth in the desert, the barren desert that was her life, and suddenly there's this thing that's fresh and new and exciting. Or we could look at it as something religious, and perhaps she's suggesting that she almost worships him in the way that we might worship a deity. I just want to take a quick look at some of the structure at this point as well. If we look at the first 5 lines up until here, we've got, if we just count the syllables, we should have, I'm looking at my notes now because I've written this down, we should have a 10 syllable pattern. I think of thee, my thoughts do twine and bud, that's 10. About thee, as wild vines about our tree, is 10. Put out broad leaves, and soon there's now to see, is 10. Except the straggling green which hides the wood, 10 syllables. Yet, oh my palm tree, be it understood, 10 syllables. So lines 1 to 5, we've got that 10 syllable pattern. In line 6, we've got, I will not have my thoughts instead of thee. We've got 10 as well. I will not have my thoughts instead of thee, 10. But in line 7, there's a change. Who art dearer, better, rather, instantly. And we've got an 11 syllable line. So we've got 6 lines of 10 syllables. And then we've got the 11 syllable line. Why? There's various ways that you could read this. For me personally, this represents the breaking of that kind of very tight syllabic rhythm represents her almost shaking herself out of her thoughts. No, these thoughts are not good enough. I will not have these thoughts instead of thee. And at that point, she's shaking herself out of those thoughts. And that change in syllables represents that change in the poem where she says, no, this is not good enough. I want something more. And she says, who art dearer, you are better. And then what happens then is that the poem begins to take a bit of a change in tone. She says, instantly renew thy presence as a strong tree should. We've got here in this line, renew thy presence, an imperative. She's calling on him. She's calling to him. She's saying, come to me now. Almost like an incantation. And this reminded me, when I first read it, of a prayer, which keys in quite nicely with this idea of the palm tree. If we're to read some sort of religious symbolism into the idea of the palm tree, then renew thy presence begins to take on sort of a bit more of a feeling if we think of it as a prayer. Imperatives are very key in prayer. Think of the Lord's Prayer. O Lord Jesus Christ, hallowed be thy name. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation. Deliver us from evil. You know, prayers are often made up of, particularly the Lord's Prayer, of lots of imperatives stacked on top of each other. She was a religious person, and if we are to think that perhaps she almost views him in a religious sense, he's that important to her. He's almost like God or Jesus in her life. He's her saviour. He saved her from this barren, devoid life that previously was a desert. Then to me, renew thy presence takes on that kind of feeling of a prayer. Okay? Either way, she's saying to him, come here, get over here right now. So if we think about this in the modern context, she's there thinking about him and she's thinking, I'm so lonely, I love him so much. And she starts to think about him. And then she thinks, why am I thinking about him? This isn't good enough. She picks up the phone and she says, I need you here. I need you in the flesh, okay? Renew thy presence as a strong tree should. And then she carries on with this extended metaphor. This extended metaphor of the tree, him being the tree. And she says, rustle thy boughs and set thy trunk all bare, and let these bands of greenery which ensphere thee drop heavily down, burst, shattered everywhere. I want to talk to you about these 4 lines that we have here. She's saying, come over here, and when you're here in the flesh and I can really see you, all these vines, these thoughts that are obscuring my mental image of you will drop away, will fall away, and I'll see you truly because you'll be here. That's the literal meaning of it. But I think there's something very sexual about these lines, I've got to say. Just think of the image of somebody standing over her like a tree, rustling his boughs and setting the trunk bare. the bands of greenery which insphere thee dropping heavily down, almost like the clothes dropping from him. To me, there's something that's very kind of sexually charged here. And then we've got this burst, shattered everywhere. We've got the Caesura. We've got these hyphens as well, this pause. Burst, shattered everywhere. And to me, the pause represents a climax. It builds to something. Renew thy presence as a strong tree should. Rustle thy boughs and set thy trunk all bare. And let these bands of greenery which ensphere thee drop heavily down. Lots of imperatives stacked on top of each other. Renew thy presence. Rustle thy boughs. Set thy trunk all bare. Let these bands of greenery which ensphere thee drop heavily down. The imperatives stacked next to each other, one after the other, create that feeling of increased pace. There's almost a list. And then we get the Caesura, which is the pause. Almost like the climax, I think, at the point of orgasm. And, I know that might sound a bit filthy, but I think there's definitely a sexual element here. And then she says burst, shattered, everywhere. Leave it to the imagination, but to me, it's definitely there. And then the next few lines are kind of calmer, because in this deep joy to see and hear thee, and breathe within thy shadow a new air, I do not think of thee, I am too near. And I think what she's saying here is, when she's actually with him, she doesn't need her thoughts, because she's got the real thing. If we look at the number of these and thys in these lines, these last few lines, hear thee, breathe within thy shadow a new air, I do not think of thee, I'm too near thee. If we look at the number of these and thys in these lines, it reinforces that very personal poem. Now he's actually here, she can actually address him directly. She also compares him to new air. I can breathe within thy shadow a new air. She uses a metaphor. He is a breath of fresh air. You know that saying, oh, you're a breath of fresh air. She essentially uses that metaphor. New air suggests that, he's almost vital to her life. A bit like that palm tree in the desert. He represents growth and newness. And again, breathing within his shadow suggests to me that he's standing over her, which again, I think could be seen as kind of vaguely sexual. Certainly, he's bigger and he's stronger than he is. So essentially what we've got going on here is a poem about a woman who's desperately in love with a man. She's thinking about him all the time, but her thoughts just aren't enough. They're not good enough. She misses him when he's not there. And when she starts thinking about him, she's overwhelmed with emotion, overwhelmed with thoughts, to the point where she can't even really focus on him anymore. So essentially, she calls on him to come to her, and he comes to her. And we've got this image of him kind of shaking the thoughts off. The tree kind of suddenly manifesting and being there. He represents this tree. He's suddenly there. He's in the room with her. He's standing above her. And she says, and when you're here, I realise that, I don't need the thoughts of you. I actually need you. And it's like breathing in fresh air when you're here. Quick word about the form. It is a sonnet. A sonnet is a 14 line poem. Tend to be are associated with love poetry. Very famous writer of sonnets is Shakespeare. I'm not going to go massively into the sonnet at the moment with you. If you're interested in the sonnet, you can Google it. There's absolutely shed loads of stuff online about sonnets, different types of sonnets, different ways of writing sonnets, and what sonnets mean and what they don't mean, and people that have played with the form, etc., etc. All I'm going to say is that I think, first of all, the sonnet suits it because it's a love poem. So the sonnet, the form suits the content, but also the form almost keeps the poem in control. She's so overwhelmed with thoughts of him that you almost get the feeling if she wasn't writing in the sonnet form, it might just become a big list of ideas and a big list of feelings that she has. The form, the tight, controlled sonnet form, you've only got 14 lines to play with. It keeps her thoughts in control. It keeps her feelings under control, which is essentially what she wants in the poem. She wants to be able to keep her feelings under control. And to me, the sonnet achieves that. So if I was going to say anything about the form of the poem and the sonnet, that's what I'd say. I haven't done you a table or anything to go with this poem. I'm going to probably do some videos where I compare it to some other poems, so you will get some ideas about how to write about it. It's a difficult poem. It is a tough poem, and you know, it's not ambiguous, but it's abstract. It's very abstract. It's full of metaphor. It's full of very abstract ideas. But spend a bit of time with it. You know, go back through this video again. I know I've given you lots of information. Go back through this video again. Sit down with the poem again. You know, listen to the video, annotate the poem, and just spend a bit of time understanding it, because once you get your head around it and around some of those abstract ideas, it's not that bad. It's just one of the poems on the syllabus that's just a little bit trickier, in many ways because of the language, the abstract ideas in it. You know, there's lots of stuff going on that make it a little bit inaccessible at first, but I'm sure if you spend a bit of time with it, you'll be fine with it. So yeah, as always, good luck with it.